So what I do, can you all hear me? Okay. I have to talk standing up this way, looking at it. I can't do this thing. So, first thing that I can't tell you is what does the EU want? These are political decisions. I can tell you how the currency works and what it can do, but what you then do with it, there are a lot of options. And I'm a little bit biased because I'm a progressive economist, I call myself, certainly anti-regressive. But I'm sort of assuming these are the things that you gravitate to, but if they're not, they're not. And MMT, understanding the currency, allows you to understand the options that exist to come up with all kinds of policies. And so standard of living, economic opportunity, full employment, social equity, free public health, kind of dignity. If the real resources are already there, it can happen. If they're not there, you've got to make do with what you have. I get a lot of questions about emerging markets and whether they can progress or not. And my stock answer is that if you look at ancient Rome, or even ancient Athens, they did pretty well. They built a nice place to live. They had no diesel fuel, they had no machinery, they had no electricity. They didn't have the IMF or the World Bank. It's like, how did they do this? Okay, it can be done. And if you look at resources they had, it was far less than we have today. You look at the crop yields back then, compared to today, it's almost nothing. So we've got, even the poorest regions now have a whole lot more than ancient Athens had to work with. So you should be able to make a place at least that nice. Now it might take a little longer if you have to do things by hand, like build your schools or whatnot, than if you have machinery, but it can be done. So to get to the most important principle, I start with the story of Panke, which is Elizabeth and I were in Pompeii a few years ago, and that's this place over here. And they said we had a guide, and there were 30 people or something that you walk in and they put you on a tour. And he said Pompeii was a very nice place to live back then. It was a desired area, even though the taxes were very high, because they had good public services, and people were willing to live there and pay the taxes because of the public services. He said, and what they would do is they would collect these coins for tax payments. Okay, and then they would pay the public servants for police protection and for keeping the streets clean and for taking care of the aqueducts so they had running water. And so they had all these public services, and so people wanted to live there. So I'm a bit of a troublemaker, so I said to him, well, you know, what actually happened is they would pay the people first, and then the taxes would get paid. And he goes, no, no, you're wrong. They would collect the tax and then pay the people. So I said, well, where did the coins come from? And they weren't valuable or anything, they were just some metal. So where did the coins come from? He said the government made them. Okay, Pompeii made them. I said, well, how did anybody get a coin to pay the tax? And he said, so they paid the people first and then they collected it. I said, how else could anybody get the coins to pay the tax? He goes, no. He walks away. He could not accept that. He'd been a guide there for 20 years. Well, of course, everyone in Pompeii knew that they would first impose some tax liability, maybe a tax on your house or something. And now everyone needed coins, one way or another, to pay the tax so they didn't lose their house. And so some people in Pompeii did this. Why did they do this? Because they wanted to hire people for public safety and everything else that they wanted. So people would show up for work, and then they'd hire them and pay them. That spent the coins into circulation, so to speak. And then those coins were then used by the taxpayers to pay the tax. And there were people who didn't want to work in the police department. They wanted to grow tomatoes, and so they would grow their tomatoes and try and sell them to people who were working for the state, who would earn more coins than they needed just to pay their taxes and buy their tomatoes. And exchange rates were there, and the whole city was monetized, and everything had a relative value based on the value of the coins. Okay, so, and they all knew that the sequence of events was tax liabilities, payment, and then collection. It was obvious. And it was obvious they weren't collecting the coins to get the money to pay the tax, to pay the people to work, pay the public service. Okay, the same thing is true today. And you go to any member of parliament, they will tell you exactly how it works. We have to collect taxes to be able to spend, And what we don't collect in taxes, we have to borrow to be able to spend more than we collect. Okay, and then we have a debt that we have to pay our grandchildren are going to have to pay back. We borrow from China, whatever the story they tell you. Okay. So, and don't think of the European Union is the same way. There are some nuances, and I'll get to those later, but that's how the currencies work. And so they've got it backwards. Right? And so the one MMT insight that kicks the whole thing off is that the government that's got its own currency, that's created its own currency, you can say issued, but that has its own currency, necessarily has to spend first, at least from inception, okay, before they can collect anything, before they can collect taxes, before bonds can be purchased, they have to spend first. It's not the other way around. And that critical insight, I'd say, has never been articulated by anybody. You're talking about Keynes or Marx or anybody in history. This seems to be the first time that it's been recognized that that's the sequence of events. So we've turned the sequence of events around, or recognized them the correct way around. Now, there was a time in history where everybody understood it. Everyone understood it in Africa when the British went in, put a tax on people's hut, told them if they didn't pay the tax, they were going to burn their hut down. And the only way they could get the tax was to come to the plantation to help grow coffee, which they did. They then got paid. They then had the money to pay the tax. They all recognized it. Okay, it was recognized by Mitchell Innes, who wrote a book in article in 1900 about it. So it's been recognized, but no school of thought has picked it up as a significant, as an understanding worthy enough to be written down. So I'm not saying, I'm the first one in history to ever do this at all. But I'm saying it's not there, and there is no member of parliament, member of Congress, any legislature in the world that has it this way. And because they've got it the wrong way around, because the government thinks it's dependent on the population to get the money it wants to spend, we're getting some policy, there are policy options that are entirely overlooked, and there are consequences that they believe can happen that have no possibility of happening. Okay, so for example, they're all afraid that crowding out, because when the government takes your money, they're crowding out things. Okay, well, they're spending it first, and then it comes back. Well, if you're spending first, you're not crowding out anything. Now, they found something like 20,000 coins in the street. How did they get there? It's the same thing. The government must have spent more than they collected, right? Otherwise, how did the coins get there? They all come from the government, right? So maybe over the years, they'd spent 100,000 coins paying people who came to work and were perfectly happy to work for these coins, and only 80,000 were paid in taxes. And the other 20,000 remained in the street, in what would have been people's pockets, in their homes, in their places of business to make change. The merchants people had reserves. They probably found some in Rome where tourists had taken them home as souvenirs, right? Okay, so what are these coins in the street? They are the public debt. They're the coins that were spent. Some were used to pay taxes, the rest are in the street. It's the coins spent that haven't yet been used to pay taxes. Think of these coins as tax credits, the thing you need to pay the tax. Okay, that's what they are. Currency is always just simply a tax credit, a thing that can be used to pay the tax. If the European Union says this cup of coffee, glass of coffee from Warren Mosler's lecture is a tax credit, you turn this in, you can take $1,000 off your taxes, this thing's worth $1,000. Anything the state says that can be used to pay taxes is worth exactly what they tell you. Okay, so what we're seeing is they would spend more than they collected, okay? And if they wanted to sell bonds, it's those 20,000 coins that would be used to buy the bonds, but they didn't do that. It didn't even occur to them to do that. Why should we pay interest on these extra coins? Nobody was demanding it for anything. They knew they didn't need to borrow the coins to be able to spend. When you think you need to borrow them to be able to spend, now you're thinking, I better have some incentive for people to lend them to me. But when you realize you're spending them first, and then if you want to give people a place to earn interest, you can, but there's no imperative to do that. You don't do it. Right? So where else do we see this happen? The idea of, let's look at the football stadium. Do they collect the ticket first and then sell it? No. You have to get the ticket out there before you can collect it. Anybody who issues anything can't collect it first. Right? So how did all the euro get there? There used to be marks and lira and everything else. What happened on day one? The European Central Bank bought the money supply. They gave you euro for whatever currency you had at some exchange rate. They were buying your old money from you. You better sell it to them because they're the only buyer out there once it's no longer used to pay taxes. All right? And once tax authorities stopped in Pompeii after the volcano hit, these things were not worth anything anymore, right? Okay, so the European Union the European Central Bank bought the money supply. That's spending first. And now there was euro out there to pay taxes. And on an ongoing basis, you can see that the European Central Bank takes positions in the money market to make sure they do what's called offset operating factors to make sure that they're spending first before taxes can get paid. It's the same thing. So everything I'm talking here is going to be applicable to what's happening today. The last thing I'm going to talk about here before we momentarily leave Pompeii, and I'll keep referring back to it. So does everybody have this model in their head about how this thing worked? Not much to it, and there isn't much to the rest either. And so actually, if you heard enough, you can leave. No? Okay, so what's the value of a coin? What's this silly thing worth? Well, it's worth whatever you have to do to get it from the person who has it, which is the city of Pompeii or the province, whatever they were. Okay, it's the taxpayers that need the government's money, and the government's the only one who can, create these things. Otherwise, you're a counterfeiter, and they were not nice to counterfeiters back then. We're not very nice to them today either, right? But they were a lot meaner, and so it's what's called a monopoly, right? And if you first week in micro, your first day in micro, they teach you about monopoly. It takes about 15 minutes. Then they teach you oligopoly. It takes 2 or 3 days. And then competition takes you the rest of your life, and you're doing asymptotes and all kinds of fancy math, right? So the good news is the money's the easy one, the one that takes 15 minutes. The monopolist has to set a price. Okay, he could set quantity and let the thing do, but for a practical purpose, he sets price. And so he says one day's work will be paid 1 coin. Let's keep the math simple here. Can anybody complain or anything? No. You need it or you're going to lose your house. Maybe the tax is 10 coins a month. You've got to get 10 coins. You're going to have to work for them, or maybe work a month and have extras so you can buy tomatoes from the guy who doesn't want to go to work as a police officer. But you've got to get your coins. And so people come to work, they get paid 1 coin a day. So what would a tomato then cost in Pompeii? Well, whatever 1 day's work is worth in the marketplace. Now you have market prices, market forces, relative value. The farmer growing the tomatoes might decide 10 tomatoes I'd rather trade 10 tomatoes for a coin than be a police officer for a day. I don't want to, it's dangerous. And the guy who's a police officer is there, you know what? I'd gladly work an extra day to get my 10 tomatoes because I don't want to get my hands dirty working in the garden over there. And there's some, buyers and sellers get together and you have a market price. And let's just say market sells it at 10 tomatoes for 1 coin. Okay, that will not change ever. Okay, unless, number 1, the government changes how much it pays to people, or number 2, you get a scarcity of tomatoes or a surplus, and then it'll fluctuate according to that. Okay, but at any point in time, there'll be a ratio of tomatoes for each coin. So what happens if the government now says, you know what, you guys are doing a great job, we're going to pay you all 2 coins a day instead of 1 coin. Now what are the tomatoes? How many tomatoes do you get for a coin? You got 10 before, now you only get 5. Because now the farmer's saying the coin's only worth half a day's work. I can go work half a day. It's only worth 5 tomatoes. I'm not gonna, if I have to give you any more than that, I'll go be a police officer. Okay, the police officer's saying, I can still get same amount of tomatoes for the day's work, 2 coins for 10 tomatoes. So its relative value doesn't change. But the value of the coin just fell in half. It used to take 1 coin to buy the tomatoes, now it takes 2. You just had 100% inflation. The prices don't. Why? Because the issuer, the government, the creator, decided to change what you had to do to get it. He made it twice as easy to get the coin. It's worth half as much. Okay, that's how monopoly works. That's how the coin works. That's what determines the price level in the economy for the euro, the dollar, the yen, all these currencies that aren't pegged. But for all practical purposes, almost every currency in the world, except maybe the Hong Kong dollar or Bulgaria or Panama or something like that, where they have fixed exchange rates. But every floating exchange rate country in the world, probably 170 of them, that's what determines value. The value is necessarily a function of prices paid by government. The government's the monopolist, whether it knows it or not. They might not know this and start paying all kinds of prices and let other things establish what prices they pay, not realizing they have control. They might do that as deliberate policy. But at the end of the day, only modern monetary theory has recognized the source of the price level. And I can tell. If you've got somebody else who's mentioned that, fine. Right now, the central banks think it's inflation expectations. If you're in Panke and they're paying 1 coin a day for labor, inflation expectations are not going to change that rate of pay or the value of that coin. And the whole inflation expectations theory is extremely suspect. It's one of the things they're reviewing. They have it out of default because they haven't figured out anything else. They've tried money supply, it didn't work. They've tried a couple of other things, aggregates and things that haven't worked. And, Phillips curve hasn't worked, and now they're on inflation expectations by default. Without that, they have nothing. In fact, in the mainstream models, last I saw, they don't have money at all. They just add it as a numeraire to keep track of all the relative value changes. Okay, they certainly haven't modeled it as a monopoly with a monopolist setting price when that's exactly what it is. Now, for you economics students, monopolists set 2 prices. One is how it exchanges for everything else. That's the exchange rate. And the other one is called the own rate. And the Austrian School of Economics talks about the own rate a lot. But that's how your thing trades for itself over time. And for money, that's the interest rate. How that particular currency exchanges for more or less currency at the end of the year. So the interest rate is called the own rate, OWN. I think economist named Marshall said that a couple of 100 years ago, coined the term, how it trades for itself. So for the currency, that's the interest rate. If it's a 10% rate, if you put away 10 of euro a year later, you get 11 back. It trades for itself at a 10% rate. So that's called the own rate. So the monopolist has to set how the thing trades for itself and how it exchanges for other goods and services. The monopolist is setting 2 prices. Well, the central bank recognizes that it has to set the interest rate, the own rate. All central banks vote on it. It's not done by market. You've heard people saying it should be done by market, but it can't because it's a monopoly. And they know that. They know that monopolists, they have the monopoly supply of what they call bank reserves. And there are entries on the central bank spreadsheet, and only they can make the entry. So they have to decide the interest rate. There's no possible market. And they do. And so, but they don't recognize that, they recognize the monopolist for the own rate, the interest rate, but not for the rate of exchange for everything else. Somehow they think that's all something else. It just never occurred to them that those same bank reserves that they're the monopoly supplier of by making entries are the things needed to pay taxes as well. Well, they are. Okay, so anyway, we'll leave Pompeii for a moment. And I'll say a word about the institutional structure here, which will explain everything. The ECB functions like the Federal Reserve. It's analogous to every central bank in the world. Not the political control. and not how they bully countries over fiscal policy, but operationally they have the same spreadsheet that everybody has. The members are now like US states. They've relegated themselves to the US states in more ways than one, more ways than just the money. Politically, the same thing has happened. Okay. Politically, they're like the US states, they no longer have any real say in international events or things like that. The members of parliament are suddenly realizing they're just tax collectors for the European Union. And people, if you're a member of parliament in Italy, you can't even get somebody to take your call in Brussels, okay? They just move back. And it's the same way in the US states. The senators from the state of New York or Florida don't have any influence on the national scene. It's all the senators in Washington who would be like the European Parliament. Unfortunately, the European Parliament, the European Parliament doesn't have the same power as our Congress does, but that's another story. It's the same change has been made. And it takes a long time for the national senators and members of parliament to realize that things have changed. And they don't like it. And I'm seeing a lot of resistance to it. And a lot of them are very upset that they're getting left out of all these things. But that's just the way it works once you've set up a system similar to what a normal country, what a unified country would have. Okay, and right now the EU budget is only a small percent of GDP, so it's not relevant. Most in the U.S. the national budget is 25% of GDP. In other European countries, when they had their own currencies, and even now it's maybe 50% of GDP or 40%. So, but right now at the national level, at the international level, it's only 2%. So it doesn't have the fiscal effect that something like the U.S. Congress would have. The European Parliament doesn't. It just doesn't have a lot of money to move one way or another. So, okay. So let me review the MMT. Whoops, did I just change that? Fundamentals. Can't say it enough time. The funds to pay taxes and buy bonds come only from the state. The ECB bought the money supply. That's where they came from initially. And then afterwards, it's the state spending. Therefore, the state necessarily from inception spends or lends first and then taxes can be paid. Therefore, state spending is not constrained by revenue. And here we're talking about Federal Reserve or the Treasury spending through its fiscal agent, the Federal Reserve, or the European Central Bank is not constrained by revenue. It's constrained only by political considerations. When we had that $1 trillion day, when they provided $1 trillion of bank liquidity, everybody was looking to see what was going to happen. Nothing happened. Nobody even noticed it. And where did they get the €1 trillion? Did I say dollars? Anyway, where did they get the €1 trillion? They don't tax anybody. They didn't borrow it from China. Okay, they just credited the accounts of the appropriate banks. That's how governments at that level, the currency issuing level, spend. That's how the Federal Reserve spends. Chairman Bernanke was asked, where's the money coming from that you're buying these securities and lending to the banks? He said, we use the computer to mark up the numbers in their accounts. It's just data entry. That's where it all comes from. There's no other way to do it. There never has been. It's not some kind of mystery. First of all, everything I tell you tonight, no one within a central bank who's got a responsible staff position will disagree with me. In fact, Vince Reinhardt was assistant to head of monetary affairs for Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke. He helped me write some of my speeches. I mean, these people all know how this stuff works. So modern monetary theory is not any mystery to central bank, senior central bank staff people. The political appointees are a different story. It's almost like none of them understand it. They've been appointed from outside. They all have their ideas about how things happen, and it's beneath them to correspond with the staff to understand how the debits and credits actually work. They just don't do it. They could, but they don't. So anyway, state spending is not constrained by revenue. Pompey didn't have people turning up for work and say, look, we've run out of money, we can't pay you. It's not an applicable thought. When you're spending first, it's just not applicable. Okay. So now you hear a money story. the conventional money story that the textbooks tell probably starts with barter exchange, or maybe on some island, a couple of people exchanging coconuts or something, or farmers, and it became convenient, and there were efficiencies to use some kind of money and all that. And I think history is telling us it didn't happen that way, but I don't really care. Okay. Today's state money story, if you want to talk about a money story that applies to what's going on today, starts this way. It starts with a state that wants to provision itself. It wants a military. Okay, it wants public health. It wants education, public education. It sees virtue in these things. It wants a legal system. Okay, and so how do you get people out of the private sector into the public sector to populate the legal system or to populate the military? Well, in the old days, maybe you'd send an army out and take slaves and put them in your army. I don't know. Or the British would go into bars at night and haul off drunks, and they'd wake up on a ship. There's all kinds of ways to provision the government. Well, so we pretend to be more civilized, right? So we do what they did in Pompeii. We impose a tax liability payable in the state's currency, which is the tax credit, I think, to pay the tax. It's a tax liability that nobody can produce except the state itself. And then, what's the point of that? Why are we producing a tax liability? Okay, to create sellers of goods and services seeking the state's currency. Why do we want to create sellers who want our otherwise worthless currency? So that the state can then hire the people it wants and buy the provisions it wants for the government, for the military, the legal system, and everything else. Okay, what do we call sellers of goods and services looking for money? Unemployment. Unemployment is not people looking for volunteer work. We don't call those people unemployed. It's people looking for paid work. So what I say now is that the purpose of taxation by design is to create unemployment. That's the cause of unemployment. There is no other cause in a monetary economy. Without the tax liability in that currency, you would not have people looking for paid work who want that currency. They might be looking for something else, but not for that currency, which is how we define unemployment. Right. So I'm not making any more of it than that, but not any less either. And if you go back in the history of thought, I don't think, I've been told no other school of thought has understood that the unemployment by design is caused by taxation. The state then makes its desired purchases. So first the tax liability, then the spending, and then taxes can be paid in bonds purchased. Again, the sequence, I'll probably said it too many times already, is critical. Okay? Now, what happens to state spending? When the state spends a euro, only one of two things can happen to that euro. It can be used to pay taxes, in which case it's lost to the economy. Your account is debited. You had 100 euro in your account, you pay 1 in tax, you've got 99, it's gone. It's not in the economy anymore. Okay, the central bank system has debited your account one way or another. The second choice is you don't use it to pay taxes, in which case it stays in the economy until it's used to pay taxes. Or if you buy something from somebody else, it's the same thing. He uses it to pay taxes or he doesn't. And by 3 o'clock when the banks close, what time do they close here? Anybody know? 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock. Okay, that dollar, if it hasn't been used to pay taxes, is in somebody's account. And it'll stay there until it's used to pay taxes. Just like the coins in Pompeii. Everybody gets paid, they're floating around somewhere. Some get used to pay taxes, the rest stay out there. The ones that stay out there are called the public debt. Public debt is the funds spent by the state that have not yet been used to pay taxes. That's all it is. Doesn't sound so bad when you look at it that way. Okay? It's best thought of as a net money supply in the economy. Some you could say net financial assets to be more technical, which is a definition of the money supply. Money supply is a very loosely defined term, but for me, it's probably the better definition of the money supply. And if you go to Pompeii, those 20,000 coins in the street were the money supply. The coins spent, not yet used to pay tax. money supply. Okay? And a growing economy is expected to include a growing net money supply. Maybe not, but they're there voluntarily. People work for those to earn them, to keep them as the money supply. It's not like they didn't want them. It's not like the government pumped them in. People are showing up for work to earn them. Okay? And so they have value. The value doesn't change. Okay, so what's happened is the tax has created a demand for two things. One, there's a need to pay taxes, and two, is the desire to save, to have a money supply. And people have a natural once there's something's needed to pay taxes, it quickly follows that it's needed for savings. It might not, but you can't say for sure that it always will, but certainly for all practical purposes, it is. And it's especially when you have tax advantage savings. Oh, if you don't spend your income, you don't have to pay taxes on it. It goes into this pension fund. Okay, now it adds reason to not spend your income and have more coins in the street if somehow you didn't have to, you got a tax advantage. Okay, as we said, taxation by design causes unemployment. Unemployment is therefore the evidence the state has not spent enough to cover the need to pay taxes and the desire to save. Unemployment is people looking for paid work. The only possible places their pay can go at the macro level is to pay taxes or not pay taxes, to save. That's why they're there. Obviously, there's been a shortfall in that need in the economy as expressed by people looking for more of this thing that has nowhere else to go. Okay? If the state, said another way, doesn't spend enough to cover the need to pay taxes and the residual desire to save, the evidence is unemployment. And the last thing that follows is unemployment is always and necessarily an unspent income story. Okay, so in the simplest case, if the total tax is $10,000 and the state decides to spend only $9,000, somebody's going to be defaulting, and you're going to have a lot of unemployed people looking for work they can't get, because that's the only source. So in that sense, unspent income, you have to look at it a little more loosely, is the tax liability has not been spent. Okay, there hasn't been enough spending to cover the tax liability. Okay, and so the state in that case is unspent income. Now I know it's not income, but the math is the same. Right? Now let's say this tax is $10,000 and the state spends $10,000. Are you going to have anybody still looking for work or facing default? Only if somebody in that economy has earned some of those coins and decided to save them. If somebody had earned 1,000 somehow and wouldn't re-spend them, so only 9,000 were available to pay taxes, you're going to have a lot of people stuck with not enough coin to pay their taxes. It's an unspent income story. Somebody did spend his income. That's called savings, okay, monetary savings. Right? So unemployment is always and necessarily an unspent income story. The government has to spend enough to cover the need to pay taxes and the need to cover the unspent income, which is the savings desires. Otherwise, there are people showing up looking for work. So when you have unemployment today, you know it's an unspent income story. It's not a productivity story. It's not about robots. That's a whole different thing. It can only be about unspent income because unemployment's a monetary phenomena. People looking for paid work, they can't find it. When all the income is spent, it doesn't happen. How do you reverse unemployment? Unemployment, I'll say it another way. You can't say it enough ways, right? Same thing. Is the evidence that the state's tax policy, which is the cause of unemployment, caused more unemployed than the state has hired. The U.S. proposes some kind of tax structure, which is fairly insane, but it's a complicated tax structure. It creates 10 million unemployed. They only hire 2 or 3 million of them. Now there's 7 million unemployed. Why? Because they made a mistake. I'll give them benefit of the doubt and say they made a mistake. If they knew the tax was going to create 10 million unemployed, maybe they would have made it smaller and only created 7 million. Okay? I'm sorry, 3 million. Maybe the tax should have been a third as large, but they did. They created all these unemployed. Okay? They have the option now to reduce the tax liability to what it should have been, because it's their mistake. You don't create unemployment just to let people default and have their houses taken away. away from them. It's because you're trying to provision the government. You're working for public purpose. Okay, you make a mistake. You create more unemployment. You can lower the taxes, in which case they should go away, because the only reason they're there is tax liabilities plus savings desires. Or increase public spending. You could hire them. Decide, well, maybe I do need more people in national health or something like that, and hire them. Right? Or have some other project that you fund, an infrastructure project or something, in which case those people get hired for that. So you've got two choices. You can increase spending or reduce taxes. And your politics will determine which one you decide to do. But you're reversing a mistake that you made if you understood what was happening, which is why I know we've got some bad people in there, but I don't think they see it that way. The job guarantee. In the first instance, this came about because recognizing, tax liabilities created more than they wanted to hire. Business won't hire people who are unemployed, many businesses. They'll only hire people already working because it's risky. They might, have a drinking problem, they might have a drug problem, they may not be clean when they come into work, they might be disruptive, they might get into fights, they might not come in on time. They like somebody with a work habit and a work ethic to hire them, especially if there's training involved, which the business is willing to do in a good economy, but they don't want to take a chance if they don't have to. So it's a whole lot safer to hire somebody already working, pay them a little extra, and then compete for the available labor force than to hire the unemployed. And in Europe, we've seen this hysteresis of every cycle, the number of unemployed and the long-term unemployed keeps going up and up. And the labor force participation is not good either, going down. And I think this is the reason. So what do we do about that? So what's happened is we not only create unemployed, but if we don't hire them, we've damaged these people by making them unemployed. It makes them unemployable. And so how do you make them employable again so they can now get back into the private sector? We've already hired all the ones we want to do the new Green Deal or whatever public service we want them to do. Hire whatever you want, I'm not saying that. But if they're still unemployed that don't fit what you want to do, hire them into a transition job, the job guarantee, to promote, facilitate the transition from unemployment, which is public sector, the government's taking them out of the private sector by the tax, and transition them back to private sector employment, so to make them hireable, and have fiscal policy loosen up, lower taxes or increase public spending, so that the private sector wants to hire people, and now the people in the job guarantee, the transition job, are attractive again. You've undone a lot of the damage and will get hired back into the private sector. And we've got case studies showing over and over again that that's exactly what happens. I can go into details later if anybody wants to know. And so the whole point in the first instance of the job guarantee is to promote this transition from unemployment caused by the government, reverse your mistake, get them back in the private sector. Because of the increased liquidity, let's call it, back and forth into the private sector, this becomes a superior price anchor versus unemployment. This will give you lower inflation outcomes than unemployment, using unemployment for the same purpose. So why not use this instead of unemployment? What possible reason could anybody give for not having an unemployed buffer stock versus an employed buffer stock if the outcome is lower inflation? Now even your furthest right wingers going, this might be a pretty good idea. Because that's their first consideration. You don't want inflation. I'm not saying they're right, but that's their first consideration. Here they've got a superior price anchor. They're sold. And in fact, the Breitbart group, with John Carney in the States, which is far right, supports the job guarantee because of this. They like the idea of getting unemployed back into the private sector. It doesn't say you cut off benefits or do anything else. You just offer a job to anybody willing and able to work. And it allows people who want to work to put themselves in a situation where they can be hired again. And again, we've shown in case studies it happens over and over again. And the paper I just wrote, I changed the name, I used the name, it's called Maximizing Price Stability in a Market Economy. How do you maximize your price stability, minimize inflation? And that is by choosing a buffer stock that's more liquid than unemployment, broader and everything else. And it turns out an employed buffer stock maximizes price stability. Therefore, it should be used by the European Central Bank as a tool for price stability They hit their targets that they're not able to hit now, and it shows how they can use full employment through a JG for superior price stability, and it was published in the Journal of Policy Models. It's a #2 mainstream journal in the world, I was told, peer-reviewed. It's co-authored by Professor Silippo at Calabria, and so it's not a heterodox idea anymore. It's mainstream. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So why aren't we doing this? Why do they set a 3% deficit limit, which isn't enough to cover the need to pay taxes and the desire to save? How do I know it isn't enough? 7, 8% average unemployment, regional running much higher. It's not nearly enough. Why is that here? We don't need to do that. We don't need to run the danger of deficits. We can use monetary policy. And they have other models showing the sensitivity to monetary policy. So we can lower interest rates, and that will do the trick. Expand aggregate demand because private sector credit growth will increase. Okay? Well, it doesn't work. That's the problem with that. Now, they won't tell you it doesn't work. Okay? The Fed, after 7 years or something like that, Janet Yellen said, well, we just need a little more time. Not too long, late last year, Mario Draghi said, well, with negative rates, we just need a little more time. After 30 years, the Bank of Japan, and this is with quantitative easing, the Bank of Japan's pretty much bought the whole public debt. They've pegged a 10-year note at 0. Okay, this is 30 years on now. We just need a little more time. It's going to work. Okay, they're still fighting deflation. I'm saying, I don't think this works. Here's interest rates here in Europe. Before the crisis, they're happy up at 5%. They cut them a lot. They raised them a little bit. That was interesting. Came back down. They've been negative. Look at how long they've been negative. Now, if these things were working, don't you think they'd be raising them back up again? Wouldn't they be afraid of hyperinflation, runaway inflation or something? This is not working. This is alone is enough to show, I'll show you more. This is not working. So why doesn't it work? What's wrong with their models? Well, I think they've totally ignored interest income channels. So I'll explain that. In the economy, private sector, for every dollar borrowed, there's a dollar lent. For every borrower, there's a saver, somebody who's loaning the money. And when you lower rates, sure, the borrowers get a break, but the savers lose their income. It's dollar for dollar, euro for euro, okay, pound for pound, it's equal in any private sector. The only way this can possibly help the economy is if the borrowers have a larger propensity to rush out and borrow than the savers have to cut back on their spending. And so if those propensities are, what they call propensities are different, if the borrowers decide to borrow a lot and the savers don't cut back on their spending, well, then the economy would be helped. But if the savers cut back equally for all the euros they lost, and the borrowers borrow more, based on all their gains, or spend more based on their gains, then it would be equal. You have to have the borrowers a lot more frisky than the savers, sensitive to this thing than the savers, right? Okay, well, let's say the borrowers, so I go to the central bank, I go to a guy named Ollender at the Fed, who has studied all these things. His name's Steve, and I go, Steve, I've had meetings with him up until the last few years. How are these propensities? How different are they? He says, well, our research, which is, 750 PhDs or something, we find that they're pretty close. We haven't found a lot of difference, but we suspect there is, but we haven't been able to detect it with the econometrics. Okay, so maybe there is a difference. When you look at the Bank of England studies about how interest rates affect things, they find almost no sensitivity. If we move rates by 100 basis points, we'll find the inflation rate and demand to go up by 0.1% with a 4-year lag, or something like that. And the ECB comes up with the same kind of results. And they've sent out 100 studies, and one of them came back that good, the rest of them didn't find anything. And that's the one they show you, because that's biased as well. Okay, so what's going on? The state, the government, in this case the euro area, all the governments together, they are large net payers of interest to the economy. They spend a lot of money on interest because their public debts are average 100% of GDP. So when interest rates go up, their deficit spending goes up. They're spending a lot more on interest. That helps the economy. It doesn't slow it down, it helps it. And in 2012, when their rates had gone way up and the economy had just started recovering again, see, how do I know? The central bank was actually raising rates a little bit. Okay, and that was helping the economy, and that's why they were doing that. Not much, but a little bit, enough to get them, because they were scared to death in 2010 that they were going to cause hyperinflation. Right? Then, and when in 2012, I was at Rimini giving a talk, and I said, yeah, Mario Draghi said, we'll do what it takes to prevent default. Italian bond rates are going to come down from 7.5 or something to whatever everybody else's were, 2 or 1, wherever they were at the time. But it's not going to help the economy because the Italian government is going to be cutting their interest expense by 3 or 4% of GDP because they're going to pay that much less interest out. Interest is like basic income for people that already have money. If you already have money, the state pays interest, it's just a bonus payment. If they don't, you don't get it. If you don't like basic income, you really don't like it to only go to people who have money. And even if you do like it, those aren't the people you want it to go to. So either way, everybody's against basic income for people who already have a lot of money. That doesn't make any sense from any perspective. And they have the least, anyway. So don't get me started. Waste your time. Yeah. So, that comes at dinner. You get all the rants. Okay, so what happened? Rates came down. Italy was saved, its credit ratings or whatever, were okay. And the economies got worse. And so rates came down again, and they've stayed bad because of this interest income channel. There's another channel called the forward pricing channel. I won't talk about that now, but those are the two channels that do it. So let's look at this here. Euro area inflation. Here's the hyperinflation. It got up to, the slide get cut off here. You can't see it on the right, it says 3%. So maybe it's the projector. Is there, can the projector screen be moved? Okay, can you see the little 2 up there?
Yeah.
Okay, see the 3 up there? Cut up to 3, and then you see 2. Okay, the core is much lower. That was because oil prices went up or something. Okay, so this is with negative rates for all those years. They're still failing now. They're under 2%. That's about 1.5 to meet their inflation target. Now, I wrote something in 2011. It was in the Huffington Post, and said it's impossible for a central bank to create inflation. Impossible. Okay, now the European Central Bank has tried with everything it has. Negative rates, huge quantitative easing of any bonds they could find in the European Union. They even put an Italian in charge of the central bank. Okay? And he can't create inflation. It's a national disgrace in Italy. They're talking about, this is like unthinkable. Tell me this stuff works and an Italian can't create inflation? They don't have a tool to their name that can cause inflation. That stuff doesn't work the way they think, right? Now, they're just talking over there about the next central bank president. I suggested they get someone from Zimbabwe. Maybe he can create something. They didn't like that suggestion too much. But I tell you, he will not be able to do it. It's not possible. It's the Federal Reserve. Japan's only had 30 years, but they think with a little more time, they can get it done. What is this? Real gross domestic product. Oh yeah, we're going to get runaway aggregate demand and everything. My screen is off a little bit. Can't move the projector. Screen. Anyway, it's going down. It's dropped. Tariff man's gotten everybody. Trump with his collapse in world global trade. But you can see it never went up all that high with negative rates. And what you'll see is a large part of this is exports. And exports you don't have. They don't help. It's not your consumption. The consumption's down around 1 or 2. The rest goes to somebody else. So the real standard of living has not gone up by that much. Somebody else's has somewhere else in the world. Okay, so the actual consumption doesn't go up. But it's going down now since, tariffs came in 2018, the trade war started. And it's going down hard. And that's with negative rates, quantitative easing, and an Italian soon to be replaced by someone from Zimbabwe. It's not creating all that, what they think is money printing is not creating any spending. It doesn't work the way they think. There's no connection. Okay. This is gross domestic product by, oh, these are the expenditures. You can't see the expenditures are going down, but you can see the chart. See how they're under 2% growth and collapsing. That's not a very good growth rate for consumer expenditures at all. It's way behind the US or anywhere else. And it's always been low because it was driven by exports. Exports are real costs, and I'll get to that in a minute. This is a quote I just got off the internet. The Eurozone's core inflation rate has been trending down for 10 years, despite increasingly unorthodox steps taken to turn it around. After falling to 0.8% year on year in March, it stands at less than half the desired rate. Okay. They just need a little more time, right? It doesn't work. Does anybody doubt yet that monetary policy doesn't work? Here's the latest manufacturing. Look what's going on. You think interest rates are going to save this one? After 10 years, all of a sudden we get some kind of a negative shock, external shock, and things are going down. What are they going to do? Oh, we'll lower rates further, we'll have more negative rates? Okay, positive rates are basic income for everybody. What are negative rates? Zero rates are neutral. Negative rates are a tax. If you have a negative 1% rate and you have 100 euros in the bank, at the end of the year you have 99. How is that different than an asset tax of 1% on your money? That's what it is, it's a tax. How's a tax supposed to help the economy? Oh, by making it larger. We'll go more negative. Go to a 10% negative rate. Take away more money, and that'll result in more spending. This defies common sense when you look at it through the correct, what they call a lens. They're starting to talk about MMT like a lens, how to see things accurately. And it's not like we're new to this. I've been talking to I remember in the end of 1997 or 8, I was at the Bank of England. Met with somebody from the Bank of Japan, with a guy named Crocker from the Bank of England. They were just doing quantitative easing. I said, well, why would you think buying securities from the Bank of Tokyo, for example, which you pay for with, when they sell them, they get more money, yen, more reserve balances in their account, is going to do anything for lending? It's not like there's a line of borrowers waiting for the bank to get, money to loan. They already had all they wanted. Loans create deposits. There's no shortage of lending. The banking system was not previously constrained by a lack of liquidity or anything. Why would this make any difference? And this guy Crocker from the Bank of England looks at the guy from the Bank of Japan and he goes, yeah, what do you got to say to that? He goes, well, we've done our model. He walks away. Okay, so they've had 25 years of this. It doesn't do anything. And here we are looking at this situation with no arrows left in the quiver. Well, you can shoot the same ones, but they don't work. This is Germans. See the little thing at the end that went up a little bit? You know what the news was? The economy's improving. It's like, okay, it's less negative. This is a good sign. Okay, maybe it is. Maybe it's going to go back up, but that's all you can do is hope. You don't have any tools to make any adjustments, to have any security here about what's going on. Okay, now here's the balance of trade. See the zero line? That's balance. Now, as you go up and run a trade surplus, you are exporting more than you're importing. So you're producing things and selling them that you're not getting to consume. So that's why your GDP goes up, because you're selling it and getting credits in some bank account, but you're not getting anything to eat or to drive around in. Those are all going to somewhere else. You make the BMW, somebody else drives it, right? And so that was propelling income and GDP numbers for a while, even though consumption wasn't going anywhere. So it just meant you had to work more and consume the same amount or less. You weren't getting the benefits. They're just, numbers were getting printed. But now that's going down with this collapse in manufacturing and everything else. So even that, when that goes away, then you don't even have the incomes. And what are they going to do? Well, use monetary policy? They wouldn't dare touch fiscal policy, the 3% sacred limit. Okay, so I'll go into trade for a moment here. How am I doing for time? My time okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so exports are real economic costs, imports are real economic benefits. Imports minus exports are the real terms of trade. So what does this mean? Think of your wealth as your pile of stuff. everything you produce domestically is your part of your wealth. That produces real wealth. If you have unemployment, that pile is going to be smaller than if you had full employment. Your real wealth will be larger. Okay, but that's whatever you produce domestically is your pile of stuff. Everything you bring in through imports makes your pile bigger, and everything you export makes your pile smaller. So you optimize your real terms of trade. You optimize your wealth by first having full employment, so you've got as much domestic output as possible. And then for whatever imports you have that are subtracting, you want to, whatever exports you have that are, you have to send to somebody else, you want to add as many imports as possible so that your pile grows from trade and doesn't shrink. Okay, the German pile has been shrinking from trade. And you can see the results in the numbers. You see the work, the hours, the income, and then the consumption is less because the pile's been shrinking, okay, from trade. Now, it's not that if you didn't trade, it would be any better. Okay, what happens is, if you're something like Italy, where you don't have the export surplus, okay, now you have unemployment because people aren't working, even if it means giving it to some other country. And you don't have any means of employing them to do something else to add to your pile. So you just wind up with a smaller domestic pile. You got a full employment plus imports minus exports. Okay, and the same thing with Greece. And I'll get into why if we run out of time. So your real wealth, real goods and services, imports, okay, full employment, same thing. Okay, so what would my proposals be for the European Union? Okay, I would increase the annual deficit limit by 5% of GDP right now, because I think your pile could be at least that much larger due to unemployment, underemployment, excess capacity, all kinds of things. So I think you could grow that much without causing unwanted inflation. Right now they're fighting, they've got core inflation at half of what they wanted, so maybe you'd even help them get it back to 2% because they think that's a good number. But it might not even be enough for that because there's so much slack in the economy. And you would have the European Central Bank fund a job guarantee because it's a tool for price stability and let them manage it to make sure it's working properly. And they've got lots of PhDs. They're going to need to do that when they don't have to do monetary policy anymore. Just leave the interest rate permanently at zero and don't even have meetings to decide where to change it. That's just leave it alone. And let's use fiscal policy. Why leave it alone? It doesn't work anyway. It's not inflationary. Japan has showed that it's deflationary to have a zero rate, which is a good thing. And the European Union has shown that it's deflationary, 0.8, close enough. And so that, and I know it is because of the interest income channels that raising rates is inflationary. The government just pumps out more interest income to everybody with nothing for sale on the supply side. It's inflationary. Turkey has low debt and 25% inflation rate with 25% interest rates. I think the interest rates are contributing, to a large degree to the inflation rate. But what do I know except that they seem to correlate everywhere in the world that it happens. And I know it could be for other reasons and all that. I've been through this, with a lot of people, and it's all counterfactuals and things like that. When you look at the interest income channels, it tells you one thing, they come up with all kinds of reasons why that might be wrong. Sure. The fact that there's 100% correlation doesn't bother them in the least. Helps me. Anyway, adequately fund public services, investment, and research with this 5%. And then the 5% becomes your policy tool. So you raise the limit from 3 to 8, which I know can't be done. I know there's issues doing that. You got to get all the finance ministers together and the European Parliament, and they got to agree to all this. I know it's an impossible political task, but that's not what I'm talking about today. But I've been through there. I got my maximizing price stability, my job guarantee funded by the ECB. I think it went through the European Parliament. Skander, has that bill gotten through Parliament yet?
Yes.
Okay, so it's there. It's gone to the finance ministers, but it's just dying, I guess. It's just sitting there. It could sit there forever. So I know the process. It worked out for 2 years. All right. So we go to 8%. Now, if the economy starts booming and they think there's going to be too much inflation, it might go to 2.1 or something, and they want to lower, and unemployment goes down to 5 or 6. First of all, there'd be partying in the streets. See, the European Union works. Monetary policy finally kicked in, right? That's probably what they'll say. And But it would be, a European miracle to have unemployment drop by 4 or 5 points. I think the rate is 8 now, European, across the whole union, but that could drop to, say, 4, let's say, with a 5% increase in deficit spending, depending on the multiples and which things you cut, which public services you have. But it's huge. You'd be getting infrastructure built, all kinds of services funded and financed. You'd have everybody working in a job guarantee, transitioning into all the new jobs, lots of people hired for the new public services. And you adjust it. If 8 becomes too high, then you lower it to 7 or 6. If it's still lots of excess capacity, go to 9 or 10. The number itself doesn't matter. It depends on the desire to save. Is the desire to save 10% of GDP, 8%, 6%? If you look at the deficit in China, it's something like 15% of GDP. And it's not inflationary because they have a strong savings desire. And that's propelling their growth. And it's been as high as 20 and 25 without being particularly inflationary, because that's their savings desire. You just need to match it to the savings desire. So I think that's the last slide. So let me just end here with another interesting bit of irony. Okay, savings in the European Union is considered a virtue. It's a good thing to be a saver. So they want the government to be a saver. We want the government to run a surplus and bring down its debt. Well, the government debt, the public debt, is just the accounting record of the money in the street in Pompeii. All right. And so if Pompeii had 20,000 coins in the street, that means the savings in the street was 20,000, but the public debt was 20,000. So the government, for accounting purposes, is a net dissaver, borrower, whatever you want to call it, has liabilities outstanding of 20,000. The European Union says, oh, well, we want the government to, reduce this indebtedness because it has all those tax liabilities, credits outstanding that it's agreed to take in. That's public debt. And so you're going to have to raise taxes and cut spending and slow down this whole economy so that the government can be a saver. Well, that doesn't make any sense. You want the people to be the savers. And you could say, look, you've got no inflation. People are working for 1 coin a day. They're saving 20,000 coins. Good job. It's a virtuous place where people are willing to work, earn the money, and save it. So the public debt is a reflection of the economy's desire to work, earn the money, and not spend it. So who were the big savers in Europe before the European Union? It was the ones with the largest public debt. They were able to spend all that extra money. It wasn't particularly causing inflation. Some places it was. Certainly not on entry into the European Union. And so Italy, Greece, were the big savers. But they needed 5, 6, 7% deficits to accommodate the people's desire to stick money in their mattresses and their pension funds and offshore, whatever they were doing with their savings. But they were saving. They were cash economies, and they had a lot of cash, net financial assets in their economies. So by limiting 3%, they weren't able to do that. Some people would save, but now the others couldn't pay their taxes, and the economies collapsed. There wasn't enough spending because too much was going into savings. So what the European Union did, and continues to do, is to punish the good savers and reward the nations that don't need to save that much, that can operate without saving, which included for a while Germany, because when you're net exporting, you've got the foreign sector doing the saving for you, somebody else is, and so you don't need it to have your jobs and your income. But you do need it for your consumption. So you get jobs and income, but your real wealth is going away. So let me say one more thing about exports being a cost. Let's look at the extremes. Suppose you exported everything and didn't import anything. Well, that should be the best, right? So what happens? Like, everybody dies. There's no food, there's no clothes. Anything you make, you're doing it for somebody else. All your public services, you have no health care. Somebody else is getting your health care services. You're in your hospitals and visiting your doctors because you're not going to consume anything. Right? So we know at the limits, exports is a problem. At the limit, if you're importing everything, okay, everything's getting done for you. You don't have to work. You can be out playing golf and doing whatever as long as you're able to import and consume these things. All right, let's look at it from another point of view. When an army conquers another territory, they get stuff from the loser. They don't send things, right? They get things. That's called importing. They don't like export everything. Oh, we won, you lost the war. We're going to export everything to you. Ha ha, you're the loser. It doesn't work that way. It's the other way around. War reparations mean you get stuff from the loser, not pay things. So exports, once you get your head around properly, are always the real cost, and imports are the real benefit. And if you look at war reparations, and let me say it right here, they talk about how the Treaty of Versailles with the outrageous demands for exports from Germany are what caused World War II, and there's a lot of truth to that, but because of the way it was done. If you look at what happened after World War II, okay, where instead, A, we worked to rebuild Germany and Japan, B, we put incentives in place, particularly psychologically, to make them export-driven economies. Okay, Japan's been sending the US 2 million cars a year for 65 years, and we haven't been sending them anything. Right, that's the biggest case of war reparations in the history of the world. They think they're winning, and we think we're losing. The same with China. We're sending trade negotiators to stop it. The European Union and Germany has exported far more than was ever demanded under the Treaty of Versailles. They think they're winning, and everybody's calling them the bad guys. It's like, what's going on here? Again, the war reparations in real terms have been far higher than anybody's ever witnessed in the history of the world. Yet, the exporters think they're winning and the importers think they're losing, and they're working feverishly to do it. Why? Because they don't understand the currency. They don't understand that when demand goes down because you have all these imports like the United States, that's what financed, use the word loosely, Trump's $1 trillion tax cut. Why did that not cause inflation? Because we had the trade deficit, $600 billion a year, $700 billion, causes that much slack in our economy, which allows a tax cut so that these people can be redeployed doing other things and other jobs, right? And they're more valuable jobs. It's always more valuable jobs. That's how markets work, that they get redeployed into. Anything you lose to trade, the next thing you have your people doing is more valuable by definition. You work through the market prices. So I want to leave you with that. And thank you very much for the opportunity to come here and talk about MMT. And
so let's start immediately with questions.
It's all been said.
I think I see a bar open. Yes, there is one being raised.
Okay, so I would argue that...
Stand up, then we can hear you, please.
Okay.
Please.
I would argue that governments only have a job guarantee program in the form of military service. So say in the United States, it's very easy to get into the US Army.
No, not anymore. Not anymore.
Not anymore what?
They're rejecting like 2 out of 3 entrants.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, well that's...
It used to be. It used to be hard to stay out of it.
Okay, that kind of negates my question.
Okay. But that for a long time did act like that. And the railroads in Australia would hire anybody to get them started and train them. And the economy's changed when the US stopped doing that with the military, and when Australia stopped doing that. Those were big social changes for the worse, and for the workforce and for everybody.
So going back to the military, I mean, in the original chicken and egg problem, so say David Graeber talks about, say, you have an invading army that goes in, and the soldiers are given these little coins in exchange for goods and services because it's too, because it's too difficult to service a military over a long distance.
Yeah.
However, this doesn't answer the chicken. This doesn't answer the chicken and egg problem. So, say tax liability is created, obviously someone has to enforce that tax liability in the first place.
You're talking about military script?
No, I'm talking about, say, 500 years ago, or
they would start with a tax liability, yeah.
Yeah, but who enforces this tax liability, and why would they?
The military.
But why would they do this in the first place? Would that be a sense of patriotism?
The military, you mean?
Yes, I mean, why would these people join the military? Is it? I mean.
Yeah, they were promised a share of what came in, and to pillage cities and things like that. to get away from their mothers, all kinds of reasons.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
What about how would you respond to that? Let's say since we have the low interest rates, the capitalists go into the real estate sector and they spend a lot of money in it and they speculate with it. So the rents go up there, and that's a huge problem here in Berlin. How would you respond to that? Because if you have an interest rate on zero, level zero, how you would like to have it, how do you reject the real estate?
So number one, what I say is, I always look for the base case for analysis. So to me, the base case for analysis is a zero rate policy like Japan has had. And real estate's high, okay, or whatever it is. And it reflects the fact that, but then rents came down and adjusted because the income side wasn't that high because you didn't have all that free money going up, right? And so the markets have to adjust to the rent or else, you don't get your return. So you can't have the places vacant either. There's no point in that. Now, the other thing I've been advocating for a long time is, it's a whole other lecture, but to replace all taxes, VAT, income taxes, everything, with a flat tax on real estate, maybe 10% of value. Okay, that takes away, now all the tax liabilities, not the revenues, but the liabilities that create the unemployment to fund the government, the whole government, are on the backs of the property owners, which is all of us, because we all have to live somewhere, we have to rent a place. But if you're a foreigner buying a place now, your tax is covering the whole, that's a big share of the whole tax liability of the whole nation rather than just whatever property taxes are. And so it makes it's hugely disadvantageous for a non-resident to pay a 10% a year tax on value. For a resident, it's not a problem because the amount they save on income tax and VAT is at least equal, if not more than that, especially at the lower income levels where those are regressive taxes. So, so I think like the high property tax replacing the other taxes, the numbers work. Does that mean it's good policy and you could do it and win a seat in parliament? No, but just to answer your question, that clean sheet of paper, that's how I would do it. Yep.
Okay, I'll try.
All right.
I got confused at the moment when you said, so when this big bank bailout thing happened and then $1 trillion was dealt with by just doing something on the computer to give to the central bank. Well, I kind of follow the hacker culture these days and following data with who's keeping track that when you say the government gave the ECB so much data credit, how do we know that that's being sort of dealt with in
I think
a real way? It's not the Pompeii coins anymore. So how is that being
I think they publish it at least weekly, or maybe monthly. And I think it might even be available in real time. So what happens is they credit the account of the member bank. It's public information. And then the member bank, keeps it as a account. The ECB can't go anywhere. They've got a spreadsheet and they say, okay, you get a number in this column, now you're okay. Let's look at a payment. Did I talk about Greece and the IMF this time? No. All right. So let's say Greece goes to the ECB and says, okay, we owe the IMF, 500 billion euro. What did they borrow? 500 billion euro? Or whatever. 500 million euro today. Please credit their account. That's what the government does. That's what a check does. It says, please debit my account and credit the other guy's account. And the ECB's got this spreadsheet right here. It's like an Excel spreadsheet. There's a line for Greece and a line for the IMF who have accounts there. And so if the ECB says, okay, and they subtract 500 million from Greece's account, which makes it minus 500 million, which operationally is not, it's just a number. And then they make the IMF's account 500 million higher, they're paid. And the records are all there. Okay, and the two entries offset, they're balanced, and they go home, and there's no problem. If they say, wait a minute, under the treaty, we're not allowed to let Greece go minus, so we can't make that payment. Now the IMF doesn't get paid, and Greece is defaulted. So the decision isn't based on the available funds at the ECB or anything like that. It's based on, it's political. All spending decisions are ultimately political. They're not based on the ability to pay. Because the ability to pay for the central bank is the ability to type in a number, to enter. It's just data entry. And so what controls it, regulates it, is politics. I'll call it political decisions, rules, regulations, treaties, whatever, and penalties for non-compliance, and things like that. And that's where all the euro, it's like if we're playing in a card game, and I'm the scorekeeper, and you're all playing cards, and you get 100 points, and I give you 100 points, like, where'd it come from? I just wrote it down in your account. Do I have 100 fewer? No. And let's say it goes to minus 100. Where do they, it's just a number, right? And if somebody somebody else, do I not have enough points now to give to somebody else? It's got nothing to do with that. It's just scorekeeping. Okay, so the whole monetary system is a scorekeeping system. And that's all it's ever been.
No, I got that part that it's
Yeah.
fiction that is being given.
Well, it's real. No, it's real. These are real tax credits. You don't pay them, you lose your house or your car or something. It's coercive. It's enforced by some kind of violence, military, police, taxes that put you in jail. There's always violence of some kind behind taxing authority, or it doesn't hold up. You can't have it voluntary. So this, your score is real because it has consequences. Let's put it that way. It's got serious consequences. Yeah, it's data, but it's consequential for sure. So when they tell a bank, here's bank liquidity and credit the account, and debit another account, and then the bank takes that and puts it then they offer the bank a 90-day account instead of a overnight account. And the money they paid to the bank that needed the money. That's called sterilization. And they're just moving it from one account to another. There's nothing actually of consequence. When bonds mature, Greek bonds mature, all they do is debit your securities account, because those are just bank accounts. The bonds are just savings accounts, time deposits, and credit your checking account. Just move the money from one account to another. It doesn't run off the computer. There's no such thing as capital flight. Euros don't go flying off to Mexico or the US. The name on the account changes, and the residency of the name on the account can change, but all the data has to be just one spreadsheet. There's no other place it can go.
Marcel.
Yeah, I had a rather technical question regarding the job guarantee wage that is being paid.
Yeah.
And I had a little talk with Scott Fulwell about it, that he would propose raising it year per year, like along the lines of the post-Keynesian golden wage rule, so inflation target plus productivity growth. And I would love to hear your take on that. Should it be just rise in line with the inflation target, or should it also be a line for productivity growth, so that the job guarantee wage earners can also participate in productivity growth, technological process?
Here you go. Got to decide what you want. Either one of them will function numerically, but they'll have marginally different consequences. One will have some kind of a inflationary bias. If you're raising it 2% a year, maybe you're supporting maybe a 2%, something less than a 2% inflation rate, because productivity is part of it.
Okay.
And so it depends on your policy goals.
Okay.
They've got this 2% inflation. I don't know why. That's kind of arbitrary. Based on some of their models that now don't work, they came up with 2%. So if the models don't work, the 2% doesn't work either. And I don't think that makes any difference whether it's 2 or 0 or 4. I think most studies have shown that it doesn't actually make any difference.
So for you, it really is dependent on the policy goals.
Yeah, if it makes everyone sleep better to
Okay.
raise it 2%, fine, or 3%, it's still going to be, everybody will adjust to it.
The main goal is to just be the inflation.
The real output.
Right.
Real output.
Yeah.
Okay, and the distributional aspects. If you have an inflationary bias, maybe you're removing money from pensioners. So maybe you want to increase your, I don't know what you call it here, or Social Security or something like that.
Okay. Thank you.
And if you do that, now the government upon pay is paying more coins for the same thing. You've redefined your currency downward. Now you've got inflation, because that's the source of inflation. But it's not might be a good policy to have 1 or 2% inflation. It depends. And if you don't like it, it doesn't like suddenly run away. You just change it to something else. It's it's not continuous. It's incremental. It's what do you call it in it's quantum moves.
Thanks.
Yeah, just very briefly, like at the point where the government has to pay service interests on its national debt,
Yeah.
Wouldn't that then like result in inflation, right? Because
Yes. So that was my point. If you raise rates, now you're crediting more interest to everybody's account. The spending is just crediting interest. And to the extent that money gets spent, it can drive up prices. If the man in the moon holds all the public debt and you give him 100% interest and he never spends it, you don't even have to report it. Nobody will ever know what happened. So it's all about propensities to spend. And, those vary. So the short answer is yes, I think higher rates cause inflation through that channel. I can't quantify it to the degree, but when the debt's 120% of GDP, and it's fairly short term, you're talking about reasonably serious effects, 1, 2, 3% of GDP as rates go up to 3, 4, 5%. 0.25% is not going to do much.
government should not issue bonds, right?
Yeah, it doesn't. I've said to not have to have a big change in institutional structure, have a 0% policy rate, something like the ECB has. It's a little bit minus, either leave it there or bring it to 0. And then don't let any of the governments issue anything longer than 3-month securities, which would all be right at 0. Then there'd never be any interest on government debt, only because I don't think that form of basic income, to me, is not in line with my progressive bias. But if somebody's highly regressive and thinks that money should go to people who already have money, well, then maybe you want a 10% policy. But that's the basis of it, not to prevent inflation or anything like that.
You talked at the beginning before you began your talk really about perhaps it was Matthew, about the Senate's.
Oh yeah. So either last week or the week before, the U.S. Senate, 5 senators introduced a bill into the Senate to condemn modern monetary theory as dangerous for the U.S. economy. So if this resolution passes, or the bill passes, then the Senate will have resolved that modern monetary theory is considered dangerous for the economy. They cite all these experts of saying that it's dangerous and things like that. So I think it's a real badge of honor that got that high in the awareness and concerned them enough to go to those lengths with all the stuff things they have to do now.
What do you think triggered it, that they've taken these steps?
I think it's fear of the left taking over. They've got this idea of some kind of a tipping point where you have the givers and the takers, the Ayn Rand type of thing. And so they think that they say, 49% of the people don't pay any taxes now. So now we're right at that point where the takers are taking over. It might be over 50%. Well, it's only 49% because they don't include FICA taxes as taxes. Those are the payroll taxes that come out of everybody's pay. It's highly regressive. It's 7.5% for the employer, 7.6% for the employee. If you include that FICA tax, it's called a tax, then it's like 75% pay taxes. But they don't include that, so they can get the number under, 50% to scare everybody that we've passed some kind of mythical tipping point where now the takers are going to vote more and more benefits for themselves, and they see this as the takers coming in now, and they're just paranoid about it, and they win votes on it. When they do this, they get campaign contributions coming in, which is what motivates them. Which brings me to my campaign finance proposal. You can give any amount of money you want to any candidate, no matter who you are, but 40% goes to the opposition. So I think that would end this whole thing about doing things for campaign contributions, making these scare tactics say, no, we'll attract a certain amount of money.
I have it's just an idea. I was thinking about taxation and what would be the difference if I was a little bit thinking about what if instead of a company is going to be taxed by their company tax, that you would buy a percentage of them, basically like 30% of Google.
Yeah, that's the same as a corporate income tax, right?
It's
It's not as good. Corporate income tax is better.
How would this in a kind of taxation, like in the macroeconomic, you say, okay, let's buy 30% of.
I think most economists will tell you what I'm going to say next, and that is corporate taxes are highly regressive because it's all passed through to the consumer, which is usually takes away from people who have the least, takes the most from the people who have the least. So I'm categorically against corporate tax. I don't see corporations as personalities. It's just a pass-through piece of paper. And so you want to do other things and not tax the consumer ultimately.
But I was referring not to taxing, but to the dividends.
Yeah, so
basically
what would the point be though? To get more money for the state?
Two things: to have political control.
Okay.
Like sitting on the advisory board of Google would be perhaps some kind of political.
Okay, so
and on the other hand, to earn the dividends.
Yeah.
That instead of taxing them, you're getting the dividends out of the profit, and so it's not a tax.
Yeah, but that money you're getting out of dividends is still coming from the consumer ultimately.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, as far as control, look, the state is granting corporations limited liability. They don't have to do that. And there was a time not that long ago, back when I was younger, where they didn't have that. And we had partnerships, and they didn't do the things corporations did because they all had personal liability. And then they were granted limited liability. Well, there's no reason that kind of a state grant shouldn't come with some kind of controls, just like deposit insurance. You have to control the lending because suddenly you're dealing with public money, right? And so with limited liability, the state has an option to be on your board and have a vote, if that's what you want. So you don't have to do it through the tax, which will be regressive. You can do it directly through the corporate structure if you think that's important. So the banking structure, they already do that. The regulators already have the ability to replace management, to change policy, to change everything, to not allow banks to function, to close them down, to, you name it, they can do it. They have almost full control, just like they do over the military. There's not a lot of difference between the control over the banks and the control over the military, except how they exercise it, right? And so there's, that's the problem. It's the lax regulation, the underfunding of regulation, which comes from lobbyists who lobby the government to cut their regulatory financing. Well, with a 60-40 rule, those lobbyists don't have that influence anymore, and hopefully it would go away. But if it doesn't, you got to try something else. But if you don't attack the finance side and the lobby side, you've given your vote away to somebody else.
Yes, so you talked about taxation causing unemployment.
Yeah, it's a tautology, it's a definition.
Right, and you would solve it by reducing taxation or increasing government spending.
Right.
But this seems not to address the problem of capital accumulation and something that Ann Pettiford talks quite a lot about, that money that should be used for employment, trading, investment is used for speculation.
Yeah. So, okay, it doesn't address everything, but it addresses unemployment problem, okay, and it addresses the aggregate demand problem. And investment is a function of sales and demand and growth. So a company that sees good sales prospects is going to invest, and then you can have additional investment opportunities by having the government fund, say, basic research, things like that come up with things that lead to investment. You can have direct investment incentives for things that feed public purpose. You can have direct government employment for public investment. There's all kinds of things you can do for investment. So you are correct, it doesn't address specifically the needs for investment, which is deferred consumption with the idea of future consumption, right? And even maintenance. We don't even have enough money going to maintenance. We have massive deferred maintenance in all of our infrastructure and everything else. Maybe not so much Germany, but the US, it's a severe problem. And I don't know about the European Union, all of it, but Italy certainly has a severe deferred maintenance problem on its, antiquities, all the infrastructure there. It's crumbling because they're not giving it, because they want to save the money rather than spend it. They're good savers and they're being punished to where they can't repair their, ancient relics. That doesn't make. I don't think that's what the European Union intends. I don't think that was the intention. So you have these unintended consequences of not understanding the monetary system that I see. Look, if you think Greeks are lazy and don't want to work, okay, number one, the statistics I think show you're wrong, but apart from that, how do you punish them? Oh, put them all out of work. It's like, what sense is happening? So the whole thing has, the monetary logic to things comes up with solutions to problems that make no sense at all, but get implemented. If somebody's lazy and doesn't want to work, if you have children, you punish them, you got to put them to work, right? You don't take their job away. It doesn't make any sense. So somehow we're not getting from here to there through the monetary system, because it is because of this lack of understanding of the monetary system. It's causing these nonsensical outcomes and illogical outcomes to perceived problems, whatever they are. So that's one more of them. To get to the investment that we need, you don't have an austerity program and cut back on you don't cut back on public spending to get more investment. That doesn't make any sense. You don't remove income to get more investment. So it's all, the whole thing's gone about it wrong. I don't know her particular proposals, but I certainly understand the problem and how to address it.
But we need to find some kind of solution that money that should be used for employment creating.
Well, it's not an either or. You can always spend additional public funding on infrastructure if you have the labor force and you have the stones and you have this. You can repair the earthquake damage at L'Aquila in Italy. It's €5 billion or something. They can't do it because they're not allowed to spend the money under their deficit limit. They've got the stones. They've got people out of work. You can, the real resources are there. It can get done. If they didn't have anybody there who knew how to do it and there weren't any stones and mortar to put back together, then you can't do it. The money can facilitate the real world. It can facilitate the public investment if the labor, capital, land, whatever, the real inputs to production are there. You can do it.
Private investment. That was his question.
Oh, private investment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mostly.
Sure. So private investment is driven by sales. If the product the sales are growing, you can raise money to do it. There aren't any examples of private investment being a function of anything, I don't think, except final sales. Amazon can raise money at zero cost, basically selling equity, because their sales are growing at 30 or 40% a year. People will fund that. But if you've got a company coming together, falling apart, you can't raise capital. And so you've got to produce a growing economy for the private sector to be able to expand to meet the demand. Capitalism is all about sales. And creative destruction is about, it's not about, having a financial crisis every 10 years and then whoever has the most capital gets to stay in business. It's about whoever has the best product and the products the consumer wants to buy, they succeed, and the people with the worst product fail. Well, instead, when you hit a financial crisis, it doesn't matter whether you got the best product or not. It's whether you can survive, your capital structure can survive. And then half the time it's the best products that fail because they ran out of money and they were stuck with inferior products because they were able to survive. So to get back to real capitalism, for that sector of the economy, the private sector, you've got to sustain aggregate demand. You have to have, business competes for consumer dollars and invests in anticipation of consumer spending. You've got to sustain consumer dollars and let the consumer decide who lives and who dies, and not the financial crisis and who gets bailed out and who doesn't. That doesn't make any sense. So it doesn't work you towards more government control of where it is best not to control. It works you towards more government control to where it should be controlled, controlling aggregate demand, controlling retirement benefits and things like that, where you don't have moral hazard and it serves public purpose. I think a lot of this is in my book, by the way. It's free online to anybody who wants to read it in English. You got to buy the German one. And Carlos has the books, and it's not much money. And I think you'll like it. What else do you have, Carlos, for sale? You've got Randy's book, which is excellent, the 1998 book that I wrote with him. Spent 2 years on that. And you'll see a lot of these things in here, spelled out a whole lot better.
Yeah. So how does, I'm still gonna be getting my head around this. I got the Panke analogy well,
Yeah.
but then when it gets into these bigger things like like the corporate tax havens and how that starts to play out on the economy. What's the position at MMT of Google and Amazon putting money into some kind of hidden...
Get rid of the corporate taxes, and you've got rid of the corporate tax havens. You just tax their real estate holdings and that type of thing.
And then the other is that with now...
Which helps the Green New Deal, by the way. If we have a 10% tax on real estate, people will think twice about putting up houses that cost 20 or 30 million euro, right? Okay, but the average person with 200,000 euro home or whatever it is, paying 20,000, it's a lot of money, but he and his wife are working, and that's less than what maybe their income taxes, value-added tax, and everything else would be. But go out and leverage up to a $2 or $3 million house, and you're not going to do that. Well, under the Green New Deal, we kind of want to discourage all that resource consumption. So it fits together, which I always have in the back of my mind, how we can do things and reduce resource consumption, improve our lives, our GDP, our real output by funding research assistance for university professors. It's a nice, low impact way to get something useful done, particularly in medical research and things like that. And cure cancer, do something useful for everybody, right? Yeah. Do you have more to?
Yeah, the aspires then.
But why don't you make a list? Seriously. Seriously, make a list of all these issues. And I do answer all my emails. And get it out there. Have you read the book yet?
No,
Okay, so a lot of it will get answered there, and it's very short. It'll take you 2 hours, hour maybe, to read the good stuff. And yeah, and all those proposals are in there.
Can I raise one more question?
Yes.
You say that exports are a bad thing for a country and they're a real cost.
They're real cost.
Yeah.
I didn't say bad, I said real cost.
Yeah, okay. But don't we, I'm just thinking about it, and don't we buy the chance in the future to buy the workforce in other countries? Let's say we export a lot and they pay money to us, and they change the numbers on our data sheet in the bank account. Don't we buy the possibility to buy the workforce in another country in the future? So let's say we export a lot, and we say, okay, now it costs us, but in the future we will be provided with their workforce.
Yeah, so Japan has $2 trillion worth of foreign exchange reserves that they earned selling us Toyotas for $2,000 each that now cost $30,000. See what I'm saying? They don't have any control. They don't get a price guaranteed when they get the money.
No.
And then if they come in to buy American-made cars, maybe there aren't even any, but if they did with that $1 trillion, $2 trillion, we get to do all kinds of things. We could have export taxes. We can limit exports to foreigners. We can do whatever we want, so they can't do that. They're taking an enormous risk with, quote, taxpayer money, public money, to do that. And if it's the private sector, that's one thing. But it doesn't naturally happen with the private sector. The only way normally you get large exporters over a sustained period of time is if the central bank buys foreign exchange reserves and accumulates them, which through market forces drives net exports. And they do that to support their exporters who are strong politically, employ millions of people, and are willing to do things that hurt the macroeconomy, keep wages down so their costs are low, so that they can make profits and make political contributions, and worse, they can be violent. Okay, they're dangerous people, and they're in control in these countries that are the large exporting countries, and they make sure the central bank buys these reserves with no intention ever of going the other way. They want to export forever. So it doesn't mean someday somebody new might come in and decide to do something, in which case the U.S. trade deficit would go away.
Would you impose restriction regarding exports?
I certainly wouldn't object to it if there was a problem. Right now, it's not a problem. And the U.S. follows a different model as others do. We use imports to drive exports rather than depressing wages and aggregate demand and keeping people poor so they can't afford their own products, so they don't consume like Germany. And instead, real wages are low because of what Draghi did with the Chinese, which is a whole other thing to get the currency down, which I think is just temporary. But what happens is the United States imports anything, let's say, up until this, our new rocket scientist in here, who's undermining our entire standard of living, thinks he's winning. Agent Orange, I call him. So, and when we import, we pay for it in dollars. Now, not all of those dollars get spent on U.S. exports, but maybe 70 or 80% do. The rest gets saved. And so we have a large trade deficit, but our exports grow at about the same pace as our imports. The two lines are pretty much parallel, but the imports are growing, are larger than the exports, even though they're growing at the same rate. So we have a gap. Well, the exporters are happy, like General Electric and those people, because their exports are large and growing. The fact that imports are higher, they don't care. They're making their profits. And President Obama got up and said, look, the country needs to consume less and export more. I mean, he supports what Trump was doing. And so who does he make as his chief economic advisor? Jeff Immelt, who is head of General Electric, our biggest exporter. That's what I'm talking about, these exporters getting control. He should not even have a seat at the table. He shouldn't be allowed in Washington because his company has no interest in benefiting U.S. residents. He needs cheap labor to be able to export. That's what he wants, is jet engines and everything else to compete with Airbus and these other people. And the domestic producers, they don't care if people get higher wages as long as everybody gets higher wages. So they're on an equal footing with the other domestic producers. So they're not the enemy. They're not Marxist capitalists the way the exporters are. It's the exporters that are the ones who want to exploit the local economy because they don't sell anything there. They sell everything to the none of the German exporters care about what the demand is here. They want, they're selling somewhere else. So you've got to be really careful about, they're dangerous animals, letting these guys have any say in domestic policy. I don't know if that alienates everybody here, but like my mother-in-law used to say, I'm too old to die young now.
All right, it's 9 o'clock. We conclude at this point. What I did want to say is we go afterwards down to Prater. Warren will be there. Dirk, everyone will be there. If you'd like to join us, just come. You're very, very welcome. They have big, long tables, and we all fit more or less. So we'll need about 15, 20 minutes to pack things, and then we'll be going down to Prater. And you're all invited to join us.